The moment Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped into Judge Andrew H. Stone's federal courtroom, the air crackled with tension. What happened in the next 30 seconds would shock the legal world and create the most viral courtroom moment of 2025. Judge Stones, sitting high on his bench in his traditional black robes, looked down at the 33-year-old freshman congresswoman with what could only be described as amusement. His weathered face, framed by silver hair and decades of courtroom authority, broke into a smirk that would soon become his biggest mistake. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom, "I've heard you have some concerns about judicial proceedings. How refreshing to have a politician lecture." The courtroom fell silent. Lawyers, court reporters, and observers all held their breath. Crockett stood at the plaintiff's table, her burgundy blazer crisp, her natural hair styled perfectly, her brown eyes blazing with a fire that Judge Stones clearly underestimated. What he didn't know was that Crockett had come prepared for war, and she was about to deliver a legal education that would leave the 67-year-old federal judge speechless and potentially end his career. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss moments like this where justice gets served in the most unexpected ways. Now let's see how a young black congresswoman from Texas just dismantled one of the most arrogant judges in America. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know who these two people really are and what brought them to this moment. Judge Andrew H. Stones has sat on the federal bench for over 20 years. Appointed during a previous Republican administration, he's known throughout legal circles as the Gavel King, a man who believes his courtroom is his kingdom and his word is absolute law. At 67, he's presided over thousands of cases, dismissed hundreds of appeals, and built a reputation for being tough on what he calls frivolous lawsuits and political grandstanding. Stones comes from old money. His family has been in Texas legal circles for generations. He attended Harvard Law, clerked for a Supreme Court justice, and has never faced a real challenge to his authority. His courtroom is decorated with portraits of legal legends, all white, all male, all from a different era. To Stones, the law is tradition, and tradition doesn't change for anyone. But Jasmine Crockett represents everything that makes Stones uncomfortable about modern America. At just 33, Crockett is a civil rights attorney turned congresswoman who grew up in the working-class neighborhoods of St. Louis. Before making her mark in Dallas, she put herself through law school, built a practice defending people who couldn't afford justice, and won her congressional seat by taking on the establishment and winning. Crockett isn't just any politician. She's a former public defender who spent years in courtrooms exactly like this one, fighting for clients that judges like Stones routinely dismissed. She knows the law better than most sitting judges, and she's never been afraid to call out injustice, even when it wears a black robe. The case that brought them together was supposed to be routine, a civil rights lawsuit alleging voter suppression in Texas, the kind of case that usually gets quietly settled or dismissed. But this case was different because it involved documented evidence of systematic disenfranchisement, evidence that Crockett had personally helped gather during her time as a civil rights attorney. The stakes couldn't be higher. This wasn't just about one lawsuit. This was about whether the federal courts would continue to protect voting rights or whether judges like Stones could simply laugh off civil rights concerns. For Crockett, this represented everything she'd fought for her entire career. For Stones, it was just another Tuesday. What neither the judge nor anyone else in that courtroom expected was that Crockett had spent months preparing for this exact moment. She knew Stones' history, his patterns, his weaknesses, and she was about to use all of it against him. The tension in Judge Stones's courtroom had been building for weeks leading up to this moment, but what happened during the first hour of proceedings would set the stage for one of the most dramatic confrontations in modern legal history. It started with the small things: the way Judge Stones consistently mispronounced Crockett's name, calling her Jasmine Crockett despite multiple corrections; the way he allowed defense attorneys to interrupt her mid-sentence while cutting her off when she tried to respond; the way he rolled his eyes when she cited recent civil rights precedents. "Your Honor," Crockett said during her opening statement, her voice steady and professional, "the evidence will show a pattern of systematic voter suppression that violated the constitutional rights of over 50,000 Texas residents." Judge Stones leaned back in his chair, abused expression on his face. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, deliberately emphasizing the wrong pronunciation, "these are serious allegations. I trust you have more than political rhetoric to support them." The first warning sign came when Stones sustained every single objection from the defense team, even ones that were clearly baseless. When Crockett presented documented evidence of polling place closures in predominantly black neighborhoods, Stones questioned its relevance. When she showed statistical analysis proving discriminatory impact, he called it speculative. But the real escalation began when Crockett attempted to introduce video evidence. "Your Honor, we have security footage from 3 Different polling locations showing poll workers turning away eligible voters. Crockett announced holding up a tablet. Objection, shouted the defense attorney. Prejudicial and inflammatory, sustained, STUNS said, without even looking at the evidence. Move on. Congresswoman Crockett's jaw tightened. Your Honor, this is direct evidence of I said move on. STUNS interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of authority that had silenced thousands of attorneys over his career. Unless you have something more substantial than amateur videos. The courtroom stirred. Reporters in the gallery exchanged glances. Even the defense attorneys looked surprised at how dismissive STUNS was being, but Crockett wasn't backing down. Your Honor, with respect, this evidence is central to our case. These amateur videos show constitutional violations in real time. That's when Judge STUNS made his first major mistake. He laughed. It wasn't a small chuckle or a polite court laugh. It was a full, condescending belly laugh that echoed through the courtroom like a slap in the face. Congresswoman, he said, still chuckling, I've been on this bench for over 20 years. I've seen every trick in the book. Cell phone videos and political grandstanding might work in Congress, but this is a court of law, real law, not whatever they're teaching in political science classes these days. The courtroom fell dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Crockett stood perfectly still for a moment, her hands resting on the plaintiff's table. When she looked up at Judge STUNS, something had changed in her eyes. The professional courtesy was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous, controlled fury backed by encyclopedic legal knowledge. Your Honor, she said, her voice now carrying a steel edge that made everyone in the courtroom sit up straighter. I'd like to approach the bench. That won't be necessary. STUNS waved her off dismissively. Let's move on to your next political point. But Crockett didn't move. Instead, she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Your Honor, before we continue, I believe there are some procedural matters the court needs to address. STUNS's smirk faltered slightly. Something in Crockett's tone had shifted, and experienced courtroom observers could sense that the dynamic was about to change completely. What procedural matters? STUNS asked, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty. Crockett opened the folder, and the sound of papers rustling seemed to echo through the silent courtroom like thunder. Well, Your Honor, it seems we need to discuss your pattern of behavior in civil rights cases over the past 5 years. The defense attorneys looked confused. The court reporter stopped typing. Everyone in the gallery leaned forward. Judge STUNS' face began to flush red. Excuse me, you see, Your Honor, Crockett continued, her voice now carrying the confidence of someone who had just played their ace card before coming here today. I took the liberty of researching your judicial record, all of it, and what I found was fascinating. The word fascinating hung in the air like a threat. Judge STUNS gripped his gavel tighter, his knuckles turning white. Congresswoman, you are out of order. Actually, Your Honor, Crockett smiled for the first time since entering the courtroom. I don't think I am. What happened next would be talked about in law schools for decades to come. Jasmine Crockett stood in the center of Judge STUNS' courtroom, holding a folder that would destroy his reputation and potentially end his career. The 67-year-old judge, who had spent 20 years believing he was untouchable, was about to learn that he had picked the wrong congresswoman to dismiss. Your Honor, Crockett began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had just loaded a legal nuclear weapon. Since you mentioned your 20 years of experience, I thought it might be helpful to review some of that experience with the court. Judge STUNS' face had gone from amused to concerned to something approaching panic. Congresswoman, this is highly irregular. What's irregular, Your Honor, is a federal judge who has systematically violated judicial ethics in civil rights cases for the past 5 years. Crockett's voice cut through his interruption like a knife. Shall we start with the Morrison case from 2023? The courtroom was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Court reporters, lawyers, and observers sat frozen as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Crockett pulled out the first document. Morrison versus Texas Secretary of State, a voting rights case remarkably similar to this one. In that case, Your Honor, you dismissed clear evidence of voter suppression while making jokes about ambulance chasing civil rights. Lawyer STUNS gripped his gavel so hard his hand was shaking. That case was dismissed on procedural grounds, was it? Crockett interrupted, pulling out another document. Because according to the court transcript, which I have right here, you told the plaintiff's attorney, and I quote, maybe stick to personal injury cases and leave constitutional law to people who understand it. Gasps echoed through the gallery. The defense attorneys looked like they wanted to disappear, but Crockett was just getting started. Then we have Henderson v. Texas Board of Elections 2022, another voting rights case, another dismissal. But this time, Your Honor, you went a step further. She pulled out a thicker document. You not only dismissed the case but sanctioned the civil rights attorneys for bringing what you called a frivolous lawsuit designed to generate media attention. Judge STUNS tried to Interrupt, but Crockett's voice rose over his. Those sanctions were later overturned by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, who found your behavior, and I quote, inappropriate and potentially biased. But you never apologized to those attorneys whose reputations you tried to destroy, did you, Your Honor? The courtroom was in chaos now. Reporters were frantically taking notes. The defense team was whispering urgently among themselves, but Crockett wasn't finished. Should I continue, Your Honor? Because I have documentation of 12 similar cases over the past 5 years, 12 civil rights cases where you showed the same pattern of dismissive behavior, inappropriate comments, and potential bias. She pulled out document after document, laying them on the table like playing cards in a deadly game of poker. Williams versus Texas Department of Public Safety dismissed with prejudice after you called the evidence political theater. Later reversed on appeal. Jackson vs. Harris County elections. You told the plaintiff's attorney to stop wasting the court's time with conspiracy theories. Also reversed on appeal. Thompson versus Texas legislature dismissed after you suggested the plaintiffs find a hobby other than suing. The state reversed on appeal and resulted in a formal reprimand from the Judicial Conduct Board. With each case, Judge STUNS seemed to shrink in his chair. His face had gone from red to pale white. The supreme confidence that had defined his career was cracking in real time, but Crockett had saved the best for last. And then, Your Honor, we have the most interesting case of all. Davis vs. Texas Attorney General 2021. Do you remember that one? STUNS' voice was barely a whisper. That case was a voting rights lawsuit brought by a coalition of civil rights organizations, and during the proceedings, Your Honor, you made some very interesting comments that were recorded and transcribed. Crockett pulled out a final document, this one marked with official court seals. You told the plaintiff's attorneys, and I'm reading directly from the transcript, these people need to stop complaining about every little rule and learn to follow the law like everyone else. The courtroom erupted. These people, everyone knew exactly what that meant, but here's the truly fascinating part, Your Honor. Crockett continued, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had just delivered a knockout punch. The case was also reversed on appeal, and the appeals court didn't just reverse your decision, they referred your conduct to the Judicial Conduct and Disability Committee for investigation. Judge STUNS looked like he had seen a ghost. That investigation was inconclusive. Crockett finished, yes, it was because, as it turns out, investigating sitting federal judges is a lengthy process, but I imagine that investigation might be reopened if new evidence of a pattern of bias were to emerge. She gestured to the pile of documents on her table. New evidence, like say 12 documented cases of inappropriate behavior in civil rights cases. New evidence, like a federal judge laughing at constitutional violations. New evidence, like a pattern of bias so clear that even a first-year law student could see it. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge STUNS sat frozen, realizing that his career, his reputation, and his legacy were crumbling in real time. But Crockett wasn't done. Your Honor, I'd like to make a motion. Her voice carried across the silent courtroom like a bell tolling. I move that this court recuse itself from this case due to demonstrated bias and prejudice against civil rights plaintiffs. I further move that this case be transferred to a judge who can evaluate the evidence without the burden of a documented history of inappropriate conduct in similar cases. She paused, letting the words sink in. And Your Honor, I respectfully suggest that you might want to consider whether continuing to preside over civil rights cases is in the best interest of justice, given the overwhelming evidence of bias I've just presented. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters rushed for the exits to file their stories. The defense attorneys huddled together in emergency consultation. Court staff whispered urgently among themselves, and Judge Andrew H. STUNS, the man who had spent 20 years believing he was untouchable, sat in his chair staring at the woman who had just ended his career with nothing but legal research and the truth. Jasmine Crockett calmly gathered her documents, placed them back in her briefcase, and waited for his response. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's devastating legal takedown seemed to stretch forever. Judge Andrew H. STUNS sat frozen on his bench, his face ashen, staring at the pile of evidence that had just demolished 20 years of unchecked judicial authority. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he managed to speak. Court is in recess. We'll resume tomorrow morning. His gavel fell with a weak tap that seemed to echo through the stunned courtroom like a death nail. But the real explosion happened the moment people stepped outside the courthouse. Within minutes, video footage from the courtroom's public gallery started flooding social media. Ever Jasmine destroys judge began trending on Twitter before STUNS had even left the building. TikTok videos showing Crockett laying out document after document went viral, with users adding dramatic music and slow motion effects to her most devastating lines. The legal community erupted in chaos. Harvard law professor Sarah Martinez tweeted, "What Jasmine Crockett just did in that courtroom was masterful legal advocacy. She didn't just win a case, she exposed systemic bias in the federal judiciary." Conservative legal commentator Tom Bradley fired back, "This was a political hit job disguised as legal procedure." Crockett turned a courtroom into a campaign rally. But the evidence spoke for itself. Legal reporters who had covered STUNS for years began digging through their archives, finding pattern after pattern of the behavior. Crockett had exposed. The Dallas Morning News published a timeline of STUNS' controversial decisions. Within hours, the Texas Tribune revealed that they had been investigating similar complaints about the judge for months but couldn't get sources to go on record. By evening, 3 major legal organizations had called for an investigation into STUNS's conduct. The American Civil Liberties Union issued a statement supporting Crockett's motion for recusal. Even the Conservative Federalist Society remained notably silent. When asked for comment the next morning brought more fallout. Judge STUNS did not appear in court. Instead, his clerk read a brief statement. Due to health concerns, Judge STUNS has requested an indefinite medical leave. This case will be transferred to Judge Maria Rodriguez for continuation. The phrase health concerns fooled no one. Legal experts recognized it as the face-saving exit strategy for a judge whose career was effectively over, but the story was far from finished. Within a week, the Judicial Conduct and Disability Committee announced they were reopening their investigation into STUNS based on new evidence of potential bias. 3 of the cases Crockett had cited filed motions to reopen based on judicial misconduct. The Justice Department quietly began reviewing civil rights cases from STUNS court going back a decade. For Crockett, the victory was both personal and professional vindication. Her congressional office was flooded with calls from civil rights attorneys across the country sharing their own stories of bias in federal courts. Law schools began inviting her to speak about judicial accountability. Legal advocacy groups hailed her as a hero for doing what many lawyers had wanted to do for years but never dared. CNN's legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin called it the most effective piece of courtroom advocacy I've seen in 30 years of covering the law. Fox News legal contributor Judge Andrew Napolitano, despite his conservative credentials, admitted Crockett's research was impeccable, her presentation was flawless, and her legal arguments were unassailable. This is how the system is supposed to work. The case itself, which had started as a routine voting rights lawsuit, transformed into something much larger. With Judge Rodriguez now presiding, the evidence Crockett had tried to present was quickly admitted. The video footage STUNS had dismissed as amateur became the centerpiece of a federal voting rights violation case that would eventually result in a multi-million-dollar settlement and court-ordered election reforms. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the federal judiciary itself. Within months, the Judicial Conference announced new mandatory training on bias in civil rights cases. The American Bar Association updated its guidelines for reporting judicial misconduct. Law schools began teaching Crockett's courtroom strategy. As an example of effective judicial accountability advocacy, Judge STUNS quietly announced his retirement 6 months later, citing a desire to spend time with family. No one was surprised. His replacement, confirmed by a bipartisan Senate vote, was a civil rights attorney who had spent her career fighting the kind of bias STUNS had represented. The broader implications extended far beyond one courtroom or one judge. Crockett's takedown demonstrated something that had been whispered about in legal circles for years, but never proven so definitively: that systematic bias in the federal judiciary was real, documented, and challengeable. Her victory inspired other attorneys to begin documenting patterns of bias in their own jurisdictions. Within a year, similar challenges were filed in courts across the country. The Crockett Protocol, as legal scholars began calling her research methodology, became a template for holding biased judges accountable. The political implications were equally significant. Crockett's stock rose dramatically within the Democratic Party. Her masterful use of legal expertise to expose systemic bias made her a sought-after voice on judicial reform. Republican attacks on her became notably muted after legal experts from across the political spectrum praised her courtroom performance. More importantly, her victory demonstrated that the traditional power structures that had protected biased judges for decades could be challenged successfully. It showed that thorough research, legal expertise, and moral courage could overcome institutional inertia. But Crockett herself remained focused on the bigger picture. In interviews following her courtroom triumph, she consistently emphasized that this wasn't about one judge or one case. This was about ensuring that every American, regardless of their background, gets equal treatment under the law. She told CNN Judge STUNS was just a symptom of a much larger problem we need to address. She used her newfound platform to push for broader judicial reforms: transparent reporting of judicial decisions by demographic categories, mandatory bias training for all federal judges, and easier procedures for challenging judicial misconduct. The BC story of that day in Judge STUNS's courtroom became more than just a viral moment. It became a symbol of how the legal system could be held accountable when people with knowledge, preparation, and courage were willing to stand up to entrenched power. For young lawyers, especially women and minorities, Crockett's victory proved that expertise and preparation could overcome institutional bias. For civil rights advocates, it demonstrated that the system, while flawed, could still be used to achieve justice, and for Judge Andrew H. STUNS it served as a reminder that in America no one, not even a federal judge, is above accountability. The case files that Crockett brought into that courtroom that day became part of the permanent record, a testament to the power of thorough preparation and the courage to speak truth to power. They sit now in the National Archives, available to any researcher studying how systematic bias in the judiciary was finally challenged and defeated. But perhaps the most lasting impact was the message it sent to every biased judge, every discriminatory official, and every person who believed their position made them untouchable. Someone is always watching, someone is always documenting, and someone like Jasmine Crockett might just be preparing to hold you accountable. The day a 33-year-old Congresswoman walked into a federal courtroom and dismantled a federal judge's career with nothing but legal research and moral courage became a landmark moment in American legal history. It proved that justice, while sometimes delayed, is never truly denied as long as people are willing to fight for it. What do you think about Jasmine Crockett's incredible courtroom performance? Have you ever seen systematic bias challenged so effectively? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss moments when justice gets served and truth wins out over institutional power. The next time someone tells you that one person can't make a difference in the system, remember the day Jasmine Crockett walked into Judge STUNS' courtroom and changed American jurisprudence forever. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.